How about books that you've read with characters who die? When I read Little Women for the first time and Beth died, there was a sense that I admit there was part of me that was quite relieved that she would move over and make room for the more interesting characters. And part of me, of course, was sad because she was the nicest character. Have you had experiences where there are characters who have died who you've really not seen coming and wished that they hadn't, or the opposite, where they haven't died and you really wish that they had?
It's not that easy to kill off a character.
I don't know. I did a rough count the other day. I've killed 17.
Well, I'm a bit more squeamish about it.
When I read The Amazing Adventures of the Cavalier in Clay by Michael Chabon, there's the brother of one of the main characters, Joe, dies, and it took me by surprise, and I don't know if I've really forgiven him for that death in that book. It was still a surprise.
I don't know. I find it hard to have these conversations without thinking about Oscar Wilde and was it Little Nell, that you would have to have a heart of stone not to laugh. I mean, they're just characters in books, they're not real people.
They're real to me, Jeff.
I remember how I cried about Judy dying in Seven Little Australians. Do you remember when that tree falls on her and they carry her away on a door? I wept for hours over that because she was the best character.
In Anna Karenina, Anna has, of course, run off with Vronsky, and her son is told that she's dead, and he doesn't believe it. And there's this wonderful line. He says he did not believe in death in general and in her death in particular. And he's right, and she does come back and see him, and no doubt his lack of belief in death is confirmed. But it's, in so many ways, Tolstoy just kind of puts his finger on how we manage the idea of our mother's loss or something like that. He did not believe in death in general and in her death in particular. I like that. And so he's a character who doesn't die in Anna Karenina. He plants a flag for survival and the perpetual mother out there somewhere, even though he's lost her in his own life.
Would you ever kill off a character in a work of fiction to satisfy some kind of desire to kill somebody in real life that you, of course, would never act on? Does that never occur to anyone else?
Well, you're on about a connection between yourself and a reader. That's what you're on about, and I mean, you could deploy your work for any number of personal reasons, but you might find that you're very alone when you do that. So I think I don't think impulsive slaughter of characters based on people that I know is something that I'd put my hand up for.
But in some books, the person has to die. But this book that I wrote called The Spare Room about a woman who looks after a friend who's got terminal cancer. Well, I had this kind of technical problem with it, which was that in the story the sick character comes to stay with the well character, and she stays for 3 weeks, and then they have a terrible falling out caused by the fact that the sick character is allowing herself to be tortured very expensively at a bullshit alternative treatment clinic. And for the sort of purposes of the book, I needed all the action to take place within 3 weeks. I needed most of the action, all the action, in fact, to take place within the tight framework of the 3-week visit. And at the end of it, the sick person goes back to Sydney, and she eventually dies. So there was going to be this I got to the end of the 3-week bit, and then I think, okay, now how do I get from here to the character's death? And it was really quite hard to do. I wrote away, I was merrily writing away, and everything I was writing seemed to be okay as writing, and it was moving the plot along. But I had this really strong sense that I was barking up the wrong tree, and there was something wrong with what I was doing. There was something structurally wrong with it. And so then I realised that I had to get the person's death into the 3-week thing with And I figured out, I know, I can do a flash forward. And so I did a flash forward. And then I kind of looped it, and I did where she dies, and then I kind of tucked that into, as it were, into the pocket of the 3-week period. But I realised that I just really didn't want the character to die. But she had to die because she had stage 4 cancer, that's one reason. But also she was a really infuriating person. But be that as it may, on the day that I actually wrote the death, I had to sort of force myself to do it. And when I got to the end, I just lay on the floor in my office and I howled and I wept and sobbed, and it was awful. I felt terrible. Not that not guilt for killing her, but just that this character was dead. It caused me a great deal of distress, and I put in my own path technical reasons not to make her die, and I had to jackhammer them out of the way.
We get attached to characters.
There's something else that I'd like to pick up on in what Helen's saying, because The Spare Room, and I'm sure many of you have read it, if not all, but it does describe some really worrying cancer treatment that is clearly not a good idea. But actually, the cancer treatment that is a good idea seems so incredibly fictional and astonishing when it's explained to you. We're going to do this and this and this, and you sit there blinking, thinking, ooh, that sounds really quite imaginative. I wonder who thought that up and under what circumstances. And I remember my oncologist saying to me, if you agree to do this, it will add 3 to 4% to your chances of survival. And I thought, that's a lot. It's 3 to 4% is, I would have wanted 95%, and so I went home and I made a phone call to a friend actually here in Melbourne, and I said 3 to 4%. She said, imagine 3 to 4% on top of your mortgage and do it. Okay, so off I went and I did it, and it was not easy, and many of you in the room will have been through it. But I guess there is something, the medical treatment in itself is a kind of narrative, and what I found when I was going through that medical treatment for cancer is that the narrative itself is profoundly sustaining, even though you meet, my prognosis was always good, but even when you meet, and I had a conservative surgeon who wanted me to go through this sort of adventurous medicine, in my terms at least, but even when you meet people whose prognosis is not good, they are tremendously sustained by the story of their ongoing treatment. The story itself, the narrative itself, is something that gives people heart, and I find that very touching, and it says something about narrative.
Yes, I hadn't thought of that, yeah.
I wanted to talk about the death of parents. It's often used in fiction as a way to give a character kind of instant freedom, I guess. And oftentimes writers give junior writers the advice to ignore or not worry about what their parents would think if they're still alive. Do you think that we all need to kill off the parents a little bit in order to write?
The murderer in my first book, it's a refrigeration mechanic. My father was a refrigeration mechanic. And I don't think I was particularly aware of that when I was writing it. It was just that the circumstances of locking someone inside a freezer seemed to me to provide, a reasonably intriguing way of killing someone. It was only when my sisters pointed this out to me that we began to think that there was possibly something else going on. So, indeed, we may be acting out in some kind of vicarious way, something kind of deeper in our writing, but I like to think that, in fact, I have no real psychological depth at all, so it sort of deals with that matter.
But you obviously have, because that story you just told is...
all these years.
But actually, early on you asked if we felt that we had the right to write about death. And I when you said that, I thought that I felt that I didn't really until my parents died. And it wasn't because they would no longer be reading what I was writing, because they never talked about that anyway, but to actually be in a room with someone you love or are in a complex, loving relationship with when they die is the most astonishing thing. And I've actually been, just by chance, been with my mother when she died, and I was with my father when he died, and I was also with my sister when she died. And it was just by happenstance that in those cases that I was in the room. And it's really quite I was thunderstruck by the kind of simplicity of it, really. And then I felt that, although by this time I'd actually been to the morgue and looked at lots of dead bodies, but they weren't people that mattered to me. And so having seen 3 people I loved just go out like a light, I sort of did feel that I kind of knew something, just some little small amount of thing about dying that made me not feel like a phony when I was writing about it. Is that why you did all that stuff?
Well, look, I think that there's clearly like an Oedipal element to writing, isn't there? I mean, an Oedipal, there's clearly, but...
So when you say clearly, just fill us in a bit there.
Well, I mean, I work for a magazine called Overland, and like all the literary magazines, we're all grappling with this question of how you negotiate the transition from print to the digital medium, yeah? Now, there's massive advantages to online publication, but by and large, writers hate it. And why do they hate it? Because what they want to do is when they get their first story published, they want to go and say to mum, I haven't been wasting all those years in front of the computer. Look what I've done. There's a book here. And it just seems to be, it's a classic kind of Oedipal thing, isn't it? It's partly sort of a gesture of... There's a subliminal kind of aggression to it. Yes. You said I was wasting all that time, sitting around and I would never come to anything. Look, here's a book. What do you know, Mum?
This is not working with me. My mother is a writer as well. And, and my father's still alive. He's 93, and he's my kind of wall and fortress against death, I think. I know I read James Bradley's book about body snatchers. I don't know if you've read it. It's really seriously troubling book and very, very well done. And I was sitting up in bed in my parents' house reading it, and I put it down. It was about 11 o'clock, and I put this book down and finished it. I thought, I'll just go down and see if Dad's awake. I felt really bad, and I needed to sit around with him for a minute. And, my parents have always been incredibly comfortable with anything that I've written. And I did worry about the war novel because he had been through... He'd been through the Middle East and Libya and then New Guinea, as a lot of men his age had done. And my grandfather was at Gallipoli and then in France. And so I felt that I was sort of walking into men's business in a big way there. And I might be walking into it in a way that really didn't work. And the fact was that when he said that he'd read it and he thought it was fine, I felt extremely sort of blessed. I really needed that, and I don't feel Oedipal or competitive with my mother, although I do notice that we're up for the same prize fairly soon.
Really?
But we don't talk about that.
It's not broached at all?
No.
Wow.
Is that worse or better than being shortlisted for the same prize with, for example, one's husband?
Oh, much better. I would be very competitive with a husband if I had such a thing, but that probably explains why I don't.
Tell me, is the announcement after Christmas dinner?
It's not we don't have family Christmases like the one in the corrections, where the mum stays at home desperately hoping that people will turn up. It's not like that, no.
Jeff, okay, yeah, there you go. As novelists, we deal with death as sort of material, as it were. You've written about death as kind of subject in a very concrete kind of way, and I'm kind of interested in what you might have to say about the way death is sort of. Is this a word? Euphemize? There are various sort of ways it's dressed up, and that, I mean, particularly in the sort of context of military death and, the state and so on. We have all collateral damage means people we don't know have just been killed, and even areas like voluntary euthanasia, which to me is an oxymoronic phrase, and we're now, it appears kind of moving inexorably to the point where you'll be able to claim your own death back as a Medibank rebate. How weird is that? Because you were explicitly looking at that, I just wonder what observations you have about that.
Well, I was really taken with an essay that William James wrote just before the First World War, which was explicitly pitched as a response to the pacifists of his day, everyone knew that there was a war that was coming, and he was saying to them, look, it's no good telling people that war is horrible and war is violence and people die in war. Actually, everyone knows that, and that's why they like war. And his argument was the possibility of violent death is the soul of romance. And so the idea that war is different from peacetime. In peacetime, nothing happens, suburban life, we live in reasonable contentment and all the rest of it. War is this other zone with violence and death, and that's what makes it exciting and compelling. And I think that's really, really true. And in fact, if you look at the way that military history is written today, this fascination with blood and death and suffering, it's not what they do is they take the tropes from the anti-war writers of the Great War and they wallow in the gore, and they use that to tell the suburban readership that war is different from your boring suburban experience. War is fascinating, war is exhilarating, the horror is what makes it fascinating. And I guess the thing that really sort of struck me was like when you talk to veterans, particularly from Iraq and Afghanistan, one of the things that they said was they often stressed was that like modern combat isn't exhilarating in the slightest. It's often because the disparity in forces is so great, it's often over before you even know that it took place. That it's when you talk to people about in the rare occasions they're in face-to-face encounters, they often can't remember shooting. So this moment, which is sold to you as the most profound experience you're ever going to have, they couldn't even remember doing it because it's all just muscle memory. They're drilled over and over again. You see the enemy, you fire. They can't remember it. So there's this contrast between this fetishization of war as this transcendental experience and then the actual experience of the contemporary military machine. It's just capitalism taken to the nth degree. It's a machine. I'm not sure if that makes any sense at all.
So, but you're saying this is what happens with modern warfare?
Yeah.
As distinct from, the cavalry charge or
yes.
hand-to-hand combat?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, what part does Xbox play in all this?
Sorry?
What part does Xbox play in all of this? I mean, you have people in large machines in Iraq who have who've been part of a culture of operating. I'm not wishing to disparage Xbox games or anything like that. I don't really have a view, but you do have a sort of a feeling of continuity almost between the sort of culture of violence on screen and the possibility at least of highly mechanised warfare, where you might have someone operating a drone in Virginia that's doing something in Pakistan, and that's just what war has become, it seems.
Yes. So they will be in a packing crate in a military base in Texas, flying Predator drones over Pakistan, carrying out assassinations, and then they will finish for the day, they will clock off and they will go home, and there's no emotional charge to it whatsoever. It's like playing a video game. So it's just the banality of, as you say, operating a computer game. So it's not that sort of transcendental experience. You're taking a human life, but you don't feel anything at all.
I think we increasingly have this kind of disconnect between the sort of reality of, of that Victorian, confrontation with the body of the loved one, and to the point where there's an overlay of euphemism and process, and that's about the Irish. That they used to have the toilet was out in the back of the house, and when someone died, the body was in the house. Now the toilet's in the house, and you have the body taken away. And those ads for prepaid funerals. What's all that about? I'm not going to prepay my fucking funeral. Excuse me. First of all, I'm going to be someone else's problem, and I'm going to, I hope it rains and people are standing up to their ankles in mud beside this hole in the ground, and that someone else is paying for it. I'm not kind of interested in having the sort of SSB saving club so that I can whisked away and happily cremated. In your face, I reckon, and pay for it.
Basically, you see your funeral as a chance for posthumous revenge.
At least discomfort. The kids, I wipe their asses for God's sake. They can shovel the dirt in the hole in the ground after me. Thank you very much. But I brought that apropos of the whole kind of the way, it's sort of, you insure against it, or you insure to cover the costs associated with it, and then, and in fact, it may have even been managed by some sort of legislated, medical intervention process, and then. In so many kind of ways where we are removed from the fact of it.
The suicide note, I just wanted to... the suicide note is one piece of literature that sort of has no right of reply. And possibly its audience isn't given much mind, arguably. But there's a finality, and the author never has to read their critics, I guess. And I guess I wanted to know whether or not you wish that you never had to hear from your critics, or is your audience very important to you when you write?
Well, I don't usually think about that.
Your audience?
That's actually a really hard question to answer, and I've never come up with an answer to it. I don't think I'm just trying to get the voice right, and I suppose that in itself assumes that the existence of someone who's going to be hearing the voice, but I don't know what to say about that.
You don't have an audience in mind.
No, I'd be really upset if I didn't have an audience. Full stop.
Yeah.
But I don't usually think about who they might be. I don't think I do. Yeah, actually, that's not true, because when I was writing The Spare Room, I kept thinking the whole time, everyone's going to really hate me when they read this book. I do remember feeling anxious about that, because I was writing...
Did you think that?
Well, I was trying to write as harshly as possible about the subject of the book. And I didn't want it to be sentimental. That's the other thing about writing about death and dying, that you have this terrific urge to kind of soften it all the time, and to and I kept noticing that when I was writing The Spare Room, that it was like I think of it as if I was trying to it had this boat and it was going along, but it kept getting all these barnacles on the bottom of it, and the barnacles represented a kind of sentimentality, a sort of, this desire to sweeten everything, and I just had to jackhammer them off. I had to be really quite violent and force myself not to offer consolation, like in the way that you were talking about, Brenda, when your reader said that you withdrew all consolation.
Well, I think also we're automatically sympathetic to the dying, but when you've got a narrator who is, struggling with certain aspects of dealing with this person who is dying, I guess that the tricky thing that you overcome is that, making us sympathise. I guess is that potentially what you were worried that might annoy people?
Well, I wanted to put into the book a lot of anger. And that's there is a lot of anger in the book, and some people, interestingly, women don't seem to have any problem with that anger. I'm not quite sure why. I mean, some men who reviewed the book were very thrown by the anger that's in it, and I was really surprised at that kind of gender matter of anger. But I think there's a lot of anger around death, because if someone's dying right in front of you and you're looking after them, what they're doing is they're sort of modelling for you what you're going to have to do eventually. And that, I imagine looking after a dying person would be, I imagine myself as being, sort of symbolically vertical, and the dying person would be horizontal. In other words, I'd have all the power, and I would be this wonderful figure full of grace and courtesy and patience, and bringing in little snacks and making this sort of smoothing the pillow and making the sheet pretty and everything. But in actual fact, I found that a dying person can be filled with rage against you and saying what this person on whose death this book is based. I remember when I was actually cooking a meal. I was in the kitchen, and she, from the other side of the room, she was kind of dying on the couch, and she said to me she was the most sweet-natured person in the world, but she suddenly spoke to me in this tone. She said, "Don't I get any of that?" And I thought, what? I was shocked, and there was this anger in the room, and neither of us could acknowledge it. But it's the kind of anger that comes at the prospect of annihilation, I think. I don't know how that answered your question properly.
Well, you've all been very illuminating. I think that we need to wrap up now, though. Could you all put your hands together for Shane Maloney, Brenda Walker, Helen Garner and Jeff Sparrow?